October 1944, Breskens, Netherlands. The rain came down in sheets, hammering against Major Elias Thorn's helmet and running in cold streams down the back of his neck. He stood alone in a muddy field behind the Canadian lines, staring at 34 wooden crosses planted in neat rows. 34 graves. Fresh dirt. Names carved into wood with military precision. The crosses were all identical. Regulation height, regulation width, nothing special about them except the names and the numbers. Private Anderson, 22. Corporal Bennett, 19. Lieutenant Foster, 28. On and on, row after row, young men from Halifax and Toronto and Vancouver, farm boys and factory workers and university students who had crossed an ocean to die in Dutch mud. Thorn was 29 years old. Before the war, he had been a deep-sea fisherman in Newfoundland, working boats in the North Atlantic where the water ran black and cold and the swells could reach 30 feet in winter storms. The Canadian Army had made him a combat engineer because he knew explosives and he never panicked when things went wrong. 15 years on fishing boats had taught him that panic killed faster than any storm. Now he stood in the rain and counted crosses. 34. 3 days. 1 fortress. The math was simple and terrible. 200 yards away, across open ground that had been farmland before the war, the German fortress rose from the seawall like a giant concrete tooth. Grey walls 12 feet thick, small windows cut into the reinforced structure, dark slits that reminded Thorn of dead eyes. Machine gun positions that could sweep every approach. Artillery pieces that commanded the Scheldt estuary and prevented Allied ships from reaching Antwerp. 1 fortress, blocking everything. Thorn reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a brass compass, old, scratched. The glass face was cracked, but it still worked. His father had given it to him when he was 16, before his first deep-sea voyage. His father had been a fisherman too, and his grandfather before that. 3 generations of men who understood that the ocean was bigger and stronger than any human being, and you survived by working with it, not against it. The compass needle swung and settled, pointing north. Thorn stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at the grey North Sea, stretching to the horizon. The water was rough today, whitecaps. The wind carried the smell of salt and kelp and something else, gunpowder. 3 days of artillery bombardment and failed assaults had left the air thick with the smell of explosives. 3 attacks in 3 days, 3 failures. The first had killed 23 men in 90 seconds, machine guns cutting them down at 150 yards. The second killed 24 more, despite smoke grenades and better tactics. The third assault ended the same way, different approach angle, better artillery support. Same result, more crosses, more letters to mothers in Canada, more failure. Thorn had watched all 3 attacks from observation posts. He understood exactly why they failed. You couldn't charge 12 feet of reinforced concrete with rifles and courage. Physics didn't care about bravery. British destroyers had fired 500 shells at those walls. The shells exploded in huge fountains of fire and smoke. When the smoke cleared, the walls showed scratches. Nothing more. The concrete was simply too thick, and yet the Allied commanders wanted to try again. Thorn turned away from the graves and walked back toward the command post, his boots squelched in the mud. Everything was mud. The rain never stopped. October in the Netherlands meant cold rain and grey skies, and mud that could swallow a truck if you parked in the wrong spot. The command post was a farmhouse that had somehow survived the fighting. Most of the windows were blown out and replaced with boards. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. Inside, the house smelled of wet wool and tobacco smoke and coffee that had been boiling too long. Lieutenant General Guy Simons was there, the highest-ranking Canadian officer in the Netherlands. Tall man, hard eyes. He commanded the entire 2nd Canadian Corps. With him were a British admiral named Harrison and an American general named Bradley. Allied cooperation. Different flags, same problem. Thorne stood in the back of the room and listened to them argue. Admiral Harrison stood with his arms crossed, looking at a map spread across a wooden table. He pointed at the fortress with a swagger stick. "We continue the naval bombardment," Harrison said. His voice carried the confidence of a man who had never seen close combat. "Bigger guns are coming. Destroyers with 8-inch cannons. We pound them day and night until the concrete cracks." General Bradley nodded agreement. "American, crew cut, clean uniform. Acceptable casualties. We prepare another infantry assault with better artillery preparation. Eventually their defenses will break. All defenses break with enough pressure." Thorne said nothing. He stood against the wall and watched rain streak down the broken windows. Simons looked at the map. His face showed nothing. "How many casualties are acceptable, General?" Bradley shrugged. 200, maybe 300. "We have reinforcements coming. The strategic value of opening Antwerp justifies the cost." 200, maybe 300. Thorne felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, not grief. Something colder, a fisherman's calculation. You didn't send men into a storm that was guaranteed to sink them. You waited. You found another route. You used your head instead of just your courage. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes. More bombing, more assaults, more acceptable casualties. Thorne listened and said nothing. He was a major. These were admirals and generals. His opinion hadn't been requested. Finally, Simons dismissed everyone except Thorne. The two men stood alone in the farmhouse. Rain drummed on the roof. Somewhere in the distance, artillery fired. The sound rolled across the flat landscape like distant thunder. Simons pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offered one to Thorne. They both lit up and smoked in silence for a moment. "You didn't agree with them," Simons said. "It wasn't a question." Thorne took a drag on the cigarette. "No, sir." "Why not?" "Because it won't work. We've tried bombardment. We've tried infantry assault. Same result every time. That fortress is too strong for conventional attacks." Simons studied him. "What would you do, Major?" Thorne hesitated. This was the moment. He could give the expected answer. Support the plan, follow orders, or he could speak the truth that had been forming in his mind since he stood looking at those 34 graves. "Sir, I'd stop fighting the fortress." "Explain." Thorne walked to the map table. He pointed at the fortress, then at the seawall it sat on, then at the grey expanse of the North Sea. "We're trying to break concrete, but we don't need to break concrete. We need to make the fortress unlivable. Force them to surrender without losing more men." "How?" "The ocean, sir." Simons raised an eyebrow. "The ocean?" "I'm a fisherman. Before the war, I spent 15 years on boats in the North Atlantic. My father taught me how we handle ice jams in the harbors back home. You don't break the ice with hammers. You use water pressure. You drill precise holes, place charges in exactly the right spots. One explosion breaks the ice jam and the current carries everything out to sea. You let physics do the work." Thorne pointed to the seawall. "Thorne, that fortress sits directly on top of the seawall, not behind it, right on top. The Scheldt estuary has the second highest tides in Europe, 45 feet difference between high tide and low tide, twice a day, every day." He traced a line on the map. 3 weeks ago, British naval bombardment damaged this section of the seawall. I've seen it through binoculars. The concrete is cracked, fractured deep into the structure. If we breach that wall at low tide, the North Sea pours through. Millions of gallons. When high tide comes 6 hours later, the fortress basement floods. Their ammunition gets soaked. Their supplies are ruined. They're standing in 6 feet of seawater with no way to pump it out fast enough. Simons stared at the map. You want to drown them out. I want to give them a choice between surrendering and drowning. They'll choose surrender. How much explosive? 400 pounds, placed in the cracks at low tide. Shape charges to direct the blast inward. Detonate at exactly 3:47 in the morning when the tide is lowest. The wall blows open and the ocean does the rest. Simons was quiet for a long moment. He smoked his cigarette down to the filter and crushed it out. Then he looked at Thorne with those hard eyes. The Admiral will oppose this. The General will oppose this. They want conventional warfare, artillery and infantry. That's how they were trained. Yes, sir.
Yi, if you're wrong, if this fails, I'll face questions from High Command about why I approved an unorthodox operation instead of following established doctrine. Yes, sir. And if you're right, if this works, we save 200 lives, maybe 300. Thorne met his gaze. That's the calculation, sir. Simons walked to the broken window and looked out at the rain. The fortress was visible in the distance, a grey mass against grey sky. For a moment, neither man spoke.
Then Simons turned back. You have 24 hours, Major. Use whatever resources you need. Gather your explosives. Plan your approach. I'll handle the Admiral and the General. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. If this doesn't work, we both face consequences, but I'm tired of writing letters to mothers in Canada telling them their sons died charging concrete walls. Thorne saluted. Simons returned it. Then Thorne walked out into the rain. He went back to his quarters. A tent behind the lines. Cold. Damp. He had a cot, a footlocker, a field desk with a lantern. He spread out his maps and pulled out the tide charts he had borrowed from a Dutch fishing boat captain. The charts showed the tidal patterns for the Scheldt estuary, precise times, water levels, current speeds. Thorne had studied these charts for the past 2 days, ever since he first started thinking about alternatives to frontal assault. Fishing taught you to read water, to understand currents and tides and how the ocean moved, to know when to fight against the current and when to use it. Most of the time you used it. Fighting the ocean was stupid. The ocean always won. Thorne's father had taught him that lesson when he was 16. They had been working a deep-sea trawler off the Grand Banks when a winter storm came up fast. 70-mile-per-hour winds, 30-foot swells. The captain wanted to run before the storm, use the engines to push through. Thorne's father had argued against it. You don't fight weather like this, his father had said. You work with it. We set a sea anchor. We drift. We let the storm pass over us. Fighting will break the boat. Drifting keeps us alive. The captain hadn't listened. He ordered full throttles. 3 hours later, the main engine died from the strain. They drifted anyway, but without power, without control. They survived, but it had been close. His father never said, "I told you so." He just looked at young Elias and said, "Ocean doesn't care about bravery. It cares about physics. Remember that." Thorne remembered. He pulled out the captured German blueprints of the fortress. A Canadian intelligence officer had taken them off a dead German engineer 2 weeks ago. The blueprints showed drainage systems, water pumps rated for 5,000 gallons per hour, designed to handle normal rainfall and normal tidal seepage. But what happened when the water wasn't normal? Thorne did the mathematics on paper. The damaged section of seawall was 32 feet wide. The wall thickness at that point was 8 feet. The foundation extended 12 feet below the current water level at low tide. 400 pounds of explosives placed in the existing cracks. Shaped charges to focus the blast. Detonation at 3:47 in the morning when the tide reached its absolute lowest point. Water pressure would be minimal. The wall would blow open. Then the North Sea would pour through at approximately 50,000 gallons per minute. The fortress drainage pumps could handle 5,000 gallons per hour. The math wasn't even close. By the time high tide came 6 hours later, the basement would be under 6 feet of water. The Germans would be trapped on the upper floors With their ammunition soaked and their supplies ruined, they would have to surrender. There was no other option, but there was one problem. He needed to verify the condition of that damaged seawall section. He needed to see it up close, measure the cracks, confirm the wall thickness, make absolutely sure the charges would breach it completely, which meant a reconnaissance mission at night, swimming in the North Sea, getting close enough to touch the wall without being seen by German sentries. Thorne looked out at the rain. The wind had picked up. The temperature was dropping. Tonight would be cold. The water would be colder. He thought about those 34 graves, about the names carved into wooden crosses, about the mothers back in Canada who would receive telegrams, about 200 more men who would die if they tried another frontal assault. Then he thought about his father's words. Ocean doesn't care about bravery. It cares about physics. Thorne folded his maps, put away his tide charts, and went to find Lieutenant Davies and Sergeant Mackenzie. He found them in a supply tent, checking equipment. Davies was 23, a talented engineer from Montreal who could build a bridge or blow one up with equal skill. Mackenzie was 35, from Halifax, a demolitions expert who had worked in mining before the war. Both men looked up when Thorne entered. "We have new orders," Thorne said. Davies straightened. "Another assault, sir?" "No, something different. Something that might actually work." He spread his maps on an ammunition crate. The two men gathered around as Thorne explained his plan. The tides, the damaged seawall, the breach, the flood. Mackenzie listened with the careful attention of a man who understood explosives. When Thorne finished, Mackenzie let out a low whistle. £400 is a lot of explosives, sir. Where do we get that much?" Thorne smiled. "We borrow it. £10 from this engineer company, 20 from that one, 15 from another. Nobody will notice until after we're done, and by then it won't matter." "And if it doesn't work?" Davies asked. The young lieutenant's voice carried doubt. "Then we're in exactly the same position we're in right now. The fortress still stands and we try something else, but if it works, we take that position without losing one more soldier." Mackenzie nodded slowly. "When do we start?" "Tonight. I need to see that seawall up close. Verify the damage, take measurements. We'll need 6 men who can swim in cold water. This is reconnaissance only. We measure, we confirm, we plan. Tomorrow night we return with explosives and flood a fortress." The two men looked at each other. Then Davies spoke. "This is completely insane, sir." "Yes, but it's better than charging that fortress again." "Yes," Mackenzie grinned. "Then let's do it." They spent the rest of the day preparing, gathering dark clothing, waterproofing measurement tools, finding 6 engineers who could swim and who wouldn't panic in cold water at night with German sentries 50 yards away. At 2200 hours, Thorne stood in his tent and stared at the brass compass one more time. The needle pointed north, steady, true. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "You don't fight the ocean, you work with it. You use its power, you let the current carry you where you want to go." Thorne slipped the compass into his waterproof pouch and stepped out into the night. The rain had stopped. Clouds covered the moon. Perfect conditions for invisible work. Behind him, 34 crosses stood in the darkness. Ahead of him, the North Sea waited with 45 feet of tidal power ready to be unleashed. 2300 hours. The moon hid behind thick clouds. Perfect. Thorne stood on the rocky shore with 6 men dressed in dark wool clothes that would turn black when wet. Davies, Mackenzie, 4 other engineers whose names Thorne had memorized along with their swimming abilities. Danny, a farm boy from Saskatchewan who had grown up swimming in cold lakes. Patterson, a fisherman's son from Prince Edward Island. Williams and Porter, both strong swimmers, both quiet men who followed orders without questions. They had blackened their faces with mud. No metal that could reflect light, No weapons except knives. They carried waterproof pouches with measurement tools, grease pencils, waterproof paper, everything they needed to examine the damaged seawall and confirm Thorne's calculations. The North Sea stretched before them like liquid darkness. The temperature had dropped. The water would be close to freezing, 4 degrees Celsius, maybe less. A man could survive 20 minutes in water that cold before hypothermia set in. Maybe 30 if he kept moving. They had 45 minutes of work to do. Thorne checked his waterproof watch. 23:15. This was reconnaissance. Tomorrow night would be the real operation. Tomorrow they would return with 400 pounds of explosives. "Listen," Thorne said quietly. The 6 men gathered close. "We swim together. Stay within arm's reach of the man next to you. The current runs east to west. We use it, don't fight it. Let the water carry us toward the damaged section. When we reach the wall, we climb onto the rocks. Work fast, work silent. If German sentries come, we freeze and we trust the darkness. Questions?" Davies raised a hand. "What if they spot us?" "They won't. Not if we're smart and quiet. The wind is coming off the land tonight. Sound carries away from the fortress. They can't see us in this darkness. We're ghosts." Mackenzie grinned, his teeth white against the mud on his face. "Ghosts who can swim in ice water." "Exactly." Thorne slipped into the water first. The cold hit him like a physical blow. His breath caught. Every muscle in his body wanted to scream and climb back onto the rocks. He forced himself to keep moving. Breathe, slow, steady. The body would adjust. 15 years on North Atlantic fishing boats had taught him that. The cold always won if you panicked. Stay calm. And the body adapted. The other men followed. Thorne heard their sharp intakes of breath as the freezing water wrapped around them. No one made more sound than that. Good soldiers, good men. They swam in a loose formation. Breaststroke, quiet, no splashing. The current carried them westward along the coast. Thorne could see the darker shadow of the seawall rising ahead. 200 yards, 150, 100. The fortress sat on top of the wall like a predator watching the ocean. Dark windows, concrete angles. Thorne could see the faint glow of lights inside. German sentries moving. Machine gun positions manned through the night. Professional soldiers doing their job. 80 yards from the wall, Thorne signaled a stop. They treaded water in silence, watching, listening. A German sentry walked along the top of the seawall, his silhouette visible against the slightly lighter sky. The man carried a rifle. He walked with the bored rhythm of a soldier on a routine patrol. 20 paces east. 20 paces west. Turn, repeat. Thorne counted the pattern. 3 minutes per circuit. When the sentry turned and walked east, Thorne signaled forward. They swam the final 80 yards in 90 seconds and reached the rocks at the base of the damaged section. The barnacles cut Thorne's hands as he climbed. Seaweed made the surface slippery. He pulled himself up slowly, testing each handhold. Behind him, the other men followed. No sound except the whisper of water against concrete and the distant murmur of waves. The damaged section looked even better than Thorne had hoped. British 8-inch shells had fractured the concrete deep into the wall's structure. He could push his fist into some of the gaps. Cracks ran vertically and horizontally like spiderwebs, perfect for placing shaped charges. Thorne pulled out his waterproof pouch. He extracted a cloth measuring tape and began taking precise measurements. The damaged section was 32 feet wide. The wall thickness at this point was 8 feet. The foundation extended 12 feet below the current waterline. Davies worked 3 feet away, examining a different crack. Mackenzie checked the wall's structural integrity by pressing against the concrete and feeling for movement. The other 4 men spread out along the damaged section, each taking their own measurements, each confirming what Thorne already knew. This wall would blow. 400 pounds of explosives placed correctly would open a breach wide enough for the ocean to pour through. Thorn was writing measurements on waterproof paper when he heard voices, German voices, close, coming from the top of the seawall. He froze, pressed himself against the wet concrete, signaled the others with a sharp hand gesture. Freeze, don't move, don't breathe. 2 German soldiers appeared at the top of the wall 15 feet above where Thorn crouched in shadow. They stood at the edge, looking out at the dark ocean. One of them lit a cigarette. The small flame briefly illuminated 2 young faces. Boys, really. 19, maybe 20 years old. They spoke in German. Thorn understood enough from his pre-war years. He had worked on international fishing vessels where German and Dutch and Norwegian crews mixed together. He knew basic phrases, enough to follow a simple conversation. "Did you hear about Hamburg?" the first soldier said. His voice carried the nervousness of youth trying to sound casual. "What about it?" the second one asked. "My brother wrote. He said the RAF bombed it again 2 weeks ago. Thousands dead. The whole city burning. Scheiße. My family's in Hamburg. My mother, my sister. Mine too. I haven't heard from them in a month. The mail isn't getting through anymore." They smoked in silence for a moment. Thorn remained absolutely still. His fingers gripped the wet concrete. The cold water lapped against his legs, 15 feet. That's how close they were. "Do you think we'll hold this fortress?" the first soldier asked. "Major Adler says we will. He says this position is critical. If the Allies take it, they open Antwerp. If they open Antwerp, they bring in supplies and the war comes to Germany faster. Maybe that's not so bad. Maybe if the war comes to Germany, it ends faster." "Don't let the Major hear you say that." "The Major isn't here." More silence. The cigarette glowed orange in the darkness. Thorn's legs were going numb from the cold water. He wanted to move, needed to move, but he remained frozen. "I just want to go home," the first soldier said quietly. "I want to know if my mother is alive. I want to sleep in my own bed. I don't care about fortresses or strategic positions or any of it. We all want to go home." The second soldier flicked his cigarette into the ocean. The tiny ember arced through the darkness and disappeared into the black water. "Come on. The Major will check our positions soon. We need to be at our posts." They walked away. Their footsteps faded. Thorn waited another full minute before he allowed himself to breathe normally. He looked at Davies crouched nearby. The young lieutenant's eyes were wide. He had understood enough to know they had been seconds away from discovery. Mackenzie, further along the wall, made a small gesture, a shrug. "Close call. Move on." Thorn finished his measurements. He mapped the exact locations where charges should be placed. He photographed the wall structure in his mind, memorizing every detail. 40 minutes had passed since they entered the water. Time to leave. They slipped back into the freezing ocean without a sound. The swim back to shore took 12 minutes. When Thorn finally pulled himself onto the rocks at the Canadian-controlled beach, his entire body shook from the cold. His hands could barely grip. His legs felt like dead wood. But they had the information they needed. Mackenzie lay on the rocks, gasping. That worked. Somehow, that actually worked. Davies sat up, water streaming from his clothes. Those Germans, they were talking about Hamburg, about their families. "I know," Thorn said. "They sounded scared. Everybody's scared. That's what war does." They returned to the Canadian lines, hot coffee, dry clothes. Thorn sat in his tent and transferred the measurements from waterproof paper to his planning maps. Every detail, every crack, every weak point in that damaged seawall. The wall would blow. He was certain now the charges would breach it completely and the North Sea would flood the fortress. Those 2 young German soldiers talking about Hamburg would have a choice. Surrender or drown. They would surrender. Thorn would make sure of that. Morning came grey and cold. Thorne spent 3 hours visiting different Canadian engineering units spread across 5 miles of front line. 10 pounds of explosives from one unit, 15 from another, 25 from a third. The engineers who gave up their stockpiles asked few questions. Engineers helped each other. They understood. By noon, Thorne had 420 pounds of various explosives assembled in a barn behind the Canadian lines. C4, TNT, Composition B. Not ideal to mix different types, but Mackenzie knew his work. He would create a unified charge that would blow consistently. Davies and Mackenzie spent the afternoon wrapping each bundle in rubberized canvas tarps normally used to cover military vehicles, every edge sealed with waterproof tape. The charges had to stay completely dry even when placed underwater at the base of the seawall. Thorne rigged the detonators using modified artillery fuses connected to waterproof watch mechanisms. If the primary detonator failed, backup fuses would trigger automatically 15 minutes later. Nothing could be left to chance. While the engineers worked, Thorne thought about those 2 German soldiers, young men worried about their mothers, wanting to go home, human beings on the wrong side of a war that had already killed millions. 200 yards away, inside the concrete fortress, Major Wilhelm Adler read a letter from his wife. The letter had been written 3 weeks ago, but mail moved slowly in wartime. His wife's handwriting was careful and precise. "My dearest Wilhelm," the letter began, "Hamburg is difficult now. The RAF comes almost every night. We spend more time in the shelter than in our home. Greta asks about you constantly. She wants to know when you're coming back. I tell her you're doing important work. She says she misses you. We all miss you." Adler folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. He stood and walked to the narrow window that looked out over the North Sea. Grey water, grey sky, everything grey. He was 44 years old. He had been a soldier for 20 years. Infantry first, then specialized training in fortress defense. The Wehrmacht had assigned him to this position 6 months ago with orders that were very clear. Hold this fortress. Prevent Allied access to Antwerp. Buy time for Germany. A young corporal knocked on the door. "Herr Major, message from Berlin." Adler took the decoded telegram, read it twice. His expression didn't change, but something tightened in his chest. The telegram was brief. "Hold fortress, minimum 2 weeks. Hamburg evacuating civilians, need time." Oberkommando. So that was it. Hamburg was being evacuated. His wife, his 3 children, Greta, who was 8 years old, and asked when he was coming home. They needed time to leave the city before the next wave of Allied bombing. Adler walked to the map on his wall. Pins marked Allied positions, Canadian forces to the west, British to the south, American units moving north. The Allies wanted this fortress badly because it blocked the Scheldt estuary. Without this fortress, they could open Antwerp and bring in 4,000 tons of supplies every day. But if Adler held for 2 weeks, Hamburg gained 2 weeks of evacuation time. 2 weeks for his family to get to safety in the countryside. 2 weeks, that might mean the difference between his children living or dying in an RAF firebombing. He wasn't fighting for Hitler. He wasn't fighting for the Reich. He was fighting to give his family time to run. "Increase sentries," Adler ordered. "Double the night patrols. Intelligence reports suggest the Canadians are planning something. I want every approach watched." "Yes, Herr Major." Adler looked out at the grey ocean one more time. Somewhere out there, Canadian soldiers were preparing another attack. He would stop them. For 2 weeks, he would stop anything they tried. For Hamburg, for his family, for Greta, who wanted to know when her father was coming home. That evening, Thorne presented his complete plan to General Simons. They met in the same farmhouse, the same map table. This time, Admiral Harrison and General Bradley were already there, waiting. Thorne spread his reconnaissance notes and calculations across the table. He explained the damaged seawall section, the tidal patterns, the precise timing required, the 400 pounds of shaped charges that would breach the wall at low tide and allow the ocean to flood the fortress basement. Admiral Harrison's face turned red before Thorne finished. "Absolutely unacceptable," Harrison said. "You want to flood a Dutch town? This is not how modern warfare is conducted." "Sir, the Dutch evacuated this area 2 weeks ago," Thorne replied, keeping his voice level. "There are no civilians, only Germans and destroyed buildings. We would be flooding an abandoned battlefield." "What if this scheme fails?" General Bradley interrupted. "What if you blow the wall and the water doesn't reach the fortress? Then what? We've wasted 400 pounds of explosives and alerted the Germans to our intentions." "Then we're in exactly the same position we're in right now," Thorne said. "The fortress still stands and we try a different approach, but if the plan succeeds, we take that position without losing one more soldier." Harrison shook his head firmly. "Proper military doctrine says we continue bombardment. Heavier guns, sustained pressure, eventually all defenses break." Bradley nodded. "We should prepare another infantry assault with better artillery preparation, overwhelming force. That's how wars are won." Thorne felt frustration building but kept his voice calm. "Sir, we've tried bombardment. 500 naval shells caused surface damage only. We've tried infantry assault 3 times, 34 casualties. That fortress is too strong for conventional attacks." "So we try harder," Harrison said. "How many more crosses do you want to plant in that field, sir?" The room went silent. Harrison's face darkened. Bradley looked away. Simons watched Thorne with those hard eyes that revealed nothing. "Major, you're out of line," Harrison said coldly. "I apologize, sir, but I'm looking at the tactical reality. We can charge that fortress again with 200 men and lose half of them, or we can use the ocean to do the work for us and lose no one." Simons stubbed out his cigarette. General, I appreciate your input. I'm approving Major Thorne's plan. We proceed tomorrow night." Harrison stood abruptly. "This is highly irregular. I'll be filing a report with High Command." "File whatever reports you want," Simons said quietly. "But this is a Canadian operation in a Canadian sector. My decision stands." The British Admiral and American General left, their displeasure obvious in every movement. When they were gone, Simons turned to Thorne. "You have 24 hours, Major. Make this work, because if it doesn't, we both face consequences." "Yes, sir."
And Thorne, you were right about the crosses. I'm tired of writing those letters too. Go flood that fortress. October 27th, 1600 hours. Thorne was reviewing his final calculations when a signals officer rushed into his tent, young, out of breath, holding a decoded message. "Sir, you need to see this. Priority intercept from German High Command to Major Adler." Thorne took the paper, read it once, read it again. His blood went cold.
"If fortress falls, activate contingency protocol V2, destroy Antwerp port infrastructure, deny enemy use, Oberkommando." "V2 rockets," the signals officer said. "Intelligence confirms the Germans have 3 rockets positioned 15 miles inland. If Adler loses the fortress, he's been ordered to destroy Antwerp with long-range bombardment." Thorne stared at the paper. Antwerp wasn't just a port. 50,000 civilians still lived in the city, dock workers, families, children. The V2 rocket was Hitler's revenge weapon. Supersonic, no warning, no defense. One rocket could destroy an entire city block. The stakes had just doubled. He wasn't just trying to save Canadian soldiers. He wasn't just trying to open a supply port. He was trying to prevent a massacre. "Does General Simons know?" Thorne asked. "Yes, sir. He said to tell you, make this work. We can't let those rockets launch." Thorne looked at his maps, at his tide calculations, at the 400 pounds of explosives wrapped and ready in the barn. Everything had to be perfect, not just for his soldiers, for 50,000 people who had no idea their lives depended on seawater and physics. He thought about those two German soldiers talking about Hamburg, about wanting to go home. Now Thorn understood the full weight of what he was doing. If the fortress fell in a conventional assault, Adler would launch the V2s before surrendering. 50,000 dead. But if the fortress flooded, if Adler had no choice but to surrender immediately without time to activate the rockets, the plan had to work. There was no other option. 2,100 hours. Thorn conducted final equipment checks in the barn. Mackenzie had finished waterproofing all 420 pounds of explosives. Davies had tested both primary and backup detonators. Everything worked. Then Davies discovered the problem. "Sir, we have an issue." Thorn looked up from his calculations. "What kind of issue?" Davies held up one of the primary detonators. The waterproof casing was cracked. Not badly, but enough that water could seep in during the operation. "How did this happen?" Mackenzie demanded. "Don't know. Maybe I dropped it. Maybe it was already damaged. Doesn't matter. We need to fix it." Thorn checked his watch. They needed to leave at 22:30 to place the charges before low tide at 03:47. That gave them 90 minutes. "Can you repair it?" Thorn asked. Mackenzie examined the damaged detonator. "Maybe. I need soldering equipment. 2 hours, minimum." "You have 90 minutes. We leave at 22:30 whether it's fixed or not. The backup detonators will work if we need them." Mackenzie and Davies worked while Thorn prepared the rest of the equipment. Dutch fishing boat arranged through the resistance, quiet engine, no lights, dark clothing, waterproof pouches. At 2200 hours, Mackenzie held up the repaired detonator. "Done. Tested. It'll work." Thorn took it carefully. The solder work was clean, professional. "Good work, Sergeant." They loaded the fishing boat at 22:30. 420 pounds of explosives in waterproof packages, detonators, tools, 6 men. Thorn at the wheel because he knew boats and these waters better than anyone else in the Canadian Army. The engine started with a quiet rumble. They slipped away from the shore into darkness. No moon tonight. Perfect conditions. Thorn steered by instinct and memory. 15 years on North Atlantic fishing boats had taught him to navigate in complete darkness, using only the feel of currents and the sound of waves against rocks. The damaged seawall section was 800 yards north by northwest. 12 minutes at quiet engine speed. The other men sat in silence. Davies checked equipment. Mackenzie smoked a cigarette cupped in his hand so the glow wouldn't show. The 4 other engineers simply waited. Good men, trusting their lives to a fisherman's knowledge and a plan that had never been tried before. This was the second time Thorn had approached that wall. The first time had been reconnaissance, measurements and planning. Tonight was execution. Tonight the ocean would become a weapon. Thorn thought about those 2 young German soldiers, worried about Hamburg, wanting to go home. In a few hours, water would pour into their fortress. They would have a choice, surrender or drown, and if they didn't surrender fast enough, if Adler had time to activate those V2 rockets, 50,000 people in Antwerp would die. Thorn hoped they chose surrender. He hoped all 180 of them chose surrender quickly, because despite the flags and the sides and the war, they were human beings, and this plan was supposed to save lives, not take them. The damaged seawall appeared ahead as a darker shadow against dark water. Thorn cut the engine. They drifted the final 100 yards on current alone. Silent, invisible, ghosts approaching concrete. Above them, inside the fortress, German sentries walked their posts. Professional soldiers doing their duty, unaware that 6 Canadians were about to change everything. Thorn checked his watch. 23:15. Low tide would come at 03:47, just over 4 hours away. They would place the charges now and detonate them at that precise moment when water pressure against the wall reached its minimum. Time to place 400 pounds of explosives and bet everything on physics. The fishing boat drifted the final 30 yards on current alone. No engine, no sound except the whisper of water against wood and the distant rhythm of waves hitting concrete. Thorne guided the boat toward the damaged section of seawall using only the pressure of the rudder. 23:15 hours, the tide was already dropping. In 4 hours and 32 minutes it would reach its absolute lowest point. The window would last 20 minutes, maybe less. Everything had to be perfect. Davies and Mackenzie moved to the bow. The 4 other engineers prepared the explosive packages, 420 pounds divided into 18 bundles, each bundle waterproofed, each bundle tested, each bundle capable of fracturing 8 feet of reinforced concrete if placed correctly. The boat touched the rocks at the base of the seawall. Thorne secured it with a line tied to a barnacle-covered outcropping. The men passed the explosive bundles hand to hand. Careful, quiet, no dropped packages, no mistakes. Thorne climbed onto the slippery rocks first. His hands found the familiar cracks from the reconnaissance swim 2 nights ago, cold, wet, sharp edges that cut through his gloves. He wedged the first 40-pound bundle deep into the largest vertical crack. The concrete edges scraped his knuckles raw. He didn't notice the pain. Adrenaline, focus. Get it done. Davies worked 3 feet away, placing another charge. Mackenzie wedged explosives into a vertical crack that ran 8 feet down into the wall's foundation. The other engineers spread across the damaged section, each man knowing his position, each man moving with practiced efficiency. Above them, German sentries walked their posts. Thorne could hear boots on concrete, voices calling out in German. "Alles klar?" All clear, the standard call between sentry positions, professional soldiers maintaining discipline through a cold night. Thorne worked faster. His fingers were going numb. The water temperature was stealing feeling from his hands. He connected detonator wires with movements that were more memory than sensation. The primary detonator, the backup detonator 15 minutes behind it, both set for 0347. 4 hours from now, when the tide reached its lowest point and water pressure against the wall would be minimal. 15 minutes passed, 12 bundles placed, 6 remaining. Then Danny dropped one. The young engineer from Saskatchewan was passing a bundle to Williams when his cold fingers lost their grip. The package slipped. 40 pounds of waterproofed explosives tumbled down the rocks and hit with a sound like a drum in the silence. Everyone froze. Above them, a German spotlight swung toward the sound. The beam cut through darkness, swept across the water, moved toward the rocks where 6 Canadians pressed themselves against wet concrete and prayed the shadows were deep enough. The light passed 10 feet to their left, paused, swept back. The beam illuminated spray from waves hitting rocks, seaweed, barnacles, nothing else. The Germans couldn't see them, not at this angle, not in these shadows. But Thorne's heart hammered against his ribs. His breath came in short gasps that he forced himself to control. One shout from above, one alert German looking down at exactly the right angle. Everything would end in machine gun fire. The spotlight swept away, moved on to the next section of seawall. The sentry called out, "Alles klar." Again, all clear. Thorne allowed himself to breathe. Davies retrieved the dropped bundle from where it had wedged between 2 rocks. No damage. They continued working. 30 minutes, all 18 bundles placed. Detonators connected, primary and backup systems tested. Everything ready. They slipped back into the fishing boat without a sound. Thorne pushed off from the rocks and let the current carry them 200 yards before starting the engine. Quiet rumble. They moved away into darkness. Behind them, 420 pounds of explosives sat in cracks in a damaged seawall, waiting, counting down. In exactly 4 hours and 2 minutes, physics would take over. Thorne positioned the boat 800 yards from the seawall, behind a rocky outcropping that would shield them from the blast. They waited in silence, cold, wet, watching the darkness. Mackenzie pulled out a thermos of coffee, passed it around. The hot liquid burned Thorne's throat, but brought feeling back to his fingers. "Think it'll work, sir?" Davies asked quietly. Thorn stared at the fortress silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. Yes. How can you be sure? Because water doesn't lie. Water follows physics, gravity, pressure, force. We've done the mathematics. The wall will breach, the ocean will flood the fortress. The Germans will surrender before those V2s launch. And if they don't surrender in time? Thorn was quiet for a moment. He thought about those 2 young soldiers he had heard during reconnaissance, talking about Hamburg, about their families, about wanting to go home. He thought about 50,000 civilians in Antwerp who didn't know their lives hung in balance. They'll surrender, Thorn said, because drowning in a basement is a terrible way to die, and they know it. They'll choose life, and they'll choose it fast. The minutes crawled past. 3 o'clock, 3:15, 3:30. At 3:45, Thorn checked his watch one final time. 2 minutes. The 6 men in the boat watched the sea wall in absolute silence. 3:47. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the sound came, not a sharp crack like artillery, not a bang like a grenade, a deep, rumbling roar that seemed to come from inside the earth itself. The sound of 420 pounds of explosives detonating simultaneously inside fractured concrete. Thorn felt the shockwave roll through the water. The boat rocked. Spray erupted from the seawall 300 feet high. Chunks of concrete flew through the air and splashed down across 100 yards of ocean. When the spray cleared, Thorn could see the gap. 30 feet wide, where solid wall had stood moments before. Ragged edges, broken concrete, an opening straight through to the land behind. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the North Sea realized there was a breach and poured through with the force of an avalanche made of water. The sound was like Niagara Falls compressed into 30 feet of width. 50,000 gallons of seawater rushed through the gap every single minute. The flow created a current so strong that debris spun in circles at the edges, white water, violent, unstoppable. Thorn watched the wave of water surge across the flat ground toward the fortress, 200 yards away. The water spread as it moved, slowed, but it kept coming. The ocean had found a new path, and nothing could stop it now. Mackenzie let out a breath he'd been holding. Dear God, it worked. Davies stared at the flood. All that water, where does it go? Into the fortress basement, Thorn said. Into their drainage systems, into every crack and opening. And in 6 hours, when high tide comes, it'll be 6 feet deep and rising. They returned to Canadian lines, reported success to General Simons. Then Thorn positioned himself in an observation post with powerful binoculars. He had to see if the plan actually worked, or if he had just given Adler time to launch those V2 rockets. The hours passed slowly. Dawn came grey and cold. Thorn watched the water creeping across the battlefield. At first, it was just a thin sheet spreading over mud and rocks. Then it began pooling in low spots. By 8 in the morning, water was 1 foot deep across a 100-yard area around the fortress. By 9, it was 2 feet deep and rising faster as the tide began coming in. Inside the fortress, Major Wilhelm Adler woke at 3:50 to the sound of an explosion. He was on his feet before his mind fully processed what had happened. Training, 20 years of military service, react first, think second. He grabbed his uniform coat and ran toward the sound. The explosion had come from outside, northwest side, possibly the seawall. He raced down the fortress stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Other soldiers were emerging from their quarters, confused, alert. "What happened?" a young corporal asked. "I don't know yet. Get to your posts. Sound general quarters." Adler reached the basement level and stopped. Water was seeping up through the floor drains. Not much. Just a thin film spreading across the concrete. But it was there, and it was rising. He splashed through it toward the northwest wall, heard the sound. Rushing water, loud, getting louder. He burst into the ammunition storage room and his stomach dropped. Water was pouring through ventilation shafts, through drainage pipes, through cracks in the foundation. Not a trickle, a flood. The room was already ankle-deep and rising fast. "Get the pumps running!" Adler shouted. "Now!" Soldiers rushed to activate the drainage pumps. The machines coughed to life, started pulling water, but Adler could see immediately that it wasn't enough. The pumps were designed to handle 5,000 gallons per hour of rainfall and normal seepage. This was something else entirely. Water rose past his ankles, past his shins. The pumps screamed and choked and couldn't keep up. "Sandbag the interior doors," Adler ordered. "Keep the water contained to the basement if possible. Move all ammunition to the upper floors. Go." His men moved with disciplined efficiency, but Adler could see the fear in their eyes. This wasn't an attack they could shoot at. This wasn't an enemy they could fight. This was water. Inexorable, patient, following the laws of physics. By 6 in the morning, water was 2 feet deep in the basement. The pumps had stopped working entirely, choked on debris, overwhelmed. Adler tried to reach Berlin on the radio. Static. He tried again. More static. The radio room was 1 floor up, but water was already seeping into the electrical systems. By 9 o'clock, water was 5 feet deep in parts of the basement. Adler stood in the main command room on the 2nd floor and watched his soldiers abandon the lower levels. They climbed stairs carrying what equipment they could save: rifles, personal belongings, photographs of families back home. A young soldier named Franz stood dripping in the doorway, 19 years old, from Munich. He had joined the Wehrmacht 8 months ago. This was his first posting. "Herr Mayer," Franz said. His voice shook. "The basement is completely flooded. We can't reach the ammunition storage. Everything is underwater." Adler nodded. "How deep?" 5 feet in the deepest sections, still rising. "How long until high tide?" Franz checked his watch with trembling hands. 47 minutes, sir." Adler walked to the narrow window and looked out. Water surrounded the fortress. It lapped against the exterior walls. It poured through the breached seawall in a continuous white torrent. The Canadians had done something he had never imagined. They had weaponized the ocean itself. Another soldier appeared, older, a sergeant named Keller. "Herr Major, we have a problem. The radio is dead. Water damage. We have no communication with Berlin." Adler felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders. 180 men trapped in a fortress filling with seawater. No radio. No way to call for help. No way to activate the V2 contingency protocol, even if he wanted to. He was alone with this decision. Franz was crying now, trying to hide it, but failing. "I don't want to drown here, sir. Please. I just want to go home." Adler looked at the young soldier, thought about his own daughter, Greta, 8 years old, learning piano, asking when her father would come home. "Sir," Keller said quietly, "we should consider our options." Before Adler could respond, another soldier rushed in, out of breath, holding a piece of paper. "Herr Major, this telegram came 3 weeks ago, but I forgot to deliver it. I'm sorry. With all the activity, Adler took the telegram, read it once, read it again. His hands started to shake. "Hamburg heavy bombing 3 weeks past. 70% city destroyed. Casualty lists incomplete. Communication difficult." Oberkommando, 3 weeks. The telegram was 3 weeks old, which meant the bombing had happened almost a month ago. While he sat in this fortress telling himself he was protecting Hamburg, buying time for evacuations, keeping his family safe. But Hamburg was already destroyed, 70%. The telegram didn't say anything about survivors. didn't mention civilian casualties, didn't tell him if his wife and 3 children were alive or dead. Adler sat down heavily. Water had reached the 2nd floor now. He could hear it sloshing in the stairwell, 6 inches deep and rising. In 30 minutes, when high tide came, this floor would flood too. He had held this fortress for almost 3 months. Following orders, doing his duty, telling himself it mattered, that he was protecting something important. But what had he protected? A port that would fall anyway, a strategic position that only delayed the inevitable. And while he held this concrete box, Hamburg burned. Franz was still standing in the doorway, still crying, still wanting to go home. Keller watched Adler with steady eyes, waiting for orders, trusting that 20 years of military experience would provide an answer. Adler looked at the telegram again. 70% destroyed. The house where his daughter learned piano, the street where his wife bought groceries, the park where his sons played football, all of it probably gone. And he didn't even know if they were alive. The V-2 rockets, he was supposed to launch them if the fortress fell. Destroy Antwerp, deny the enemy. But the radio was dead, and even if it worked, what was the point? More death, more destruction. Hamburg was already destroyed. Would destroying Antwerp bring his family back? 9:47, high tide. The water level jumped dramatically. Adler watched it rise up the walls. 6 feet deep in the basement now, 3 feet on this floor. It poured through ventilation shafts. It came up through floor drains. It flooded through the main doors. 180 men crowded onto the 3rd and 4th floors, running out of dry space, running out of options. Herr Major, Keller said quietly, if we don't surrender soon, we drown. There's no shame in choosing life. Adler stood, looked at Franz, looked at Keller, looked at all the young faces watching him, waiting for him to save them or kill them with his decision. He thought about Greta asking when he would come home. He didn't even know if she was alive to ask that question anymore, but if she was, if by some miracle his family had survived, then he needed to survive too, so he could go home and find them. Hoist the white flag, Adler said. The words felt like surrender, felt like failure. 20 years of military service ending in a flooded fortress. But they also felt like the only human choice left. Franz stopped crying. Relief flooded his young face. Keller nodded with approval. Other soldiers started moving immediately. Someone found a white bedsheet. Someone else rigged it to a broken radio antenna on the roof. At 10:15, the white flag rose above the fortress. Thorne saw it through his binoculars. A bedsheet tied to a radio antenna. White fabric snapping in the wind. He lowered the binoculars and felt something break inside his chest. Not grief, not joy. Something else, relief maybe, or exhaustion, or the weight of 34 graves finally lifting. They surrendered, he said quietly. Mackenzie clapped him on the shoulder. We did it, sir. Not one Canadian died, and those V2s stay in the ground. Thorne nodded. Couldn't speak. Couldn't process it yet. He had gambled everything on physics and ocean currents and a fisherman's understanding of tides. And it had worked. Antwerp was safe. The soldiers were safe. Both sides. At 10:30, the main fortress door opened. German soldiers began wading out through chest-deep water. Hands raised above their heads, uniforms soaked, faces showing shock and confusion and relief. They came in groups of 10 and 20, 180 men. Some were crying. Some looked angry. Most just looked exhausted and beaten. Major Wilhelm Adler emerged last at 11 o'clock. He waded through the water still wearing his officer's cap. Carried nothing except his dignity. Water dripped from his uniform. A Canadian officer met him, accepted his formal surrender. Adler handed over his pistol. Then Adler turned and looked back at his fortress, sitting in 6 feet of seawater. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, the voice of a man who had just lost everything but was determined to maintain composure. "You did not fight us with guns, you fought us with the sea." The Canadian officer nodded toward Thorne standing nearby. That was Major Thorne's plan. Adler looked at Thorne. The two men studied each other. Enemy officers meeting across the wreckage of conventional warfare. "I've been a soldier for 20 years, Adler said in careful English. "I have never seen anything like this." Thorne stepped forward. "I'm sorry it had to be this way." Adler actually smiled, small, sad. "Sorry. You saved 180 of my men. If you had attacked with infantry, I ordered them to fight to the death. We would have killed many Canadians, you would have killed many Germans, and I would have launched the V2 rockets to destroy Antwerp before surrendering. 50,000 civilians dead, now everyone lives. War should end with surrenders, not graves." "Yes, it should, but it rarely does." Adler paused. "May I know your name?" "Major Elias Thorne." "Wilhelm Adler, I will remember your name, Major, the man who understood that the ocean is stronger than concrete." They didn't shake hands, not yet, too soon for that, but something passed between them, a recognition, a shared understanding that they were both just men trying to survive a war neither had started. German POWs were loaded onto trucks. Adler climbed in last. As the truck pulled away, he looked back one final time at the fortress that had been his command for 3 months. Water still poured through the breached seawall. The fortress stood like an island in a shallow lake. Thorne watched them go, felt the weight of what had just happened settling into his bones. 180 enemies who got to go home, 200 Canadian soldiers who didn't have to die charging concrete, 50,000 civilians in Antwerp who would never know how close they came to annihilation. Physics had won the day, but it was the choice to work with nature instead of fighting it that had saved lives. Mackenzie stood beside him. "What now, sir?" "Now the Scheldt estuary is open. Antwerp receives supplies. The war continues."
But without those 34 graves becoming 200, think they'll remember this? What you did here? Thorne looked at the flooded fortress one last time. "I don't know. I hope they remember the lesson, that smart beats strong, that physics beats bullets, that working with nature is better than fighting it." But mostly he hoped they remembered the lives saved, Canadian and German both, because in the end, that was all that mattered.
Epilogue. Within 72 hours, the first Allied supply ships reached Antwerp. 4,000 tons of supplies every single day began flowing to Allied armies. The war would continue for 7 more months, but the Scheldt estuary was open. Thorne's tidal breach tactic was taught in every Allied engineering school. The war ended in May 1945. Elias Thorne returned to Newfoundland in August 1946. He became harbour master for his home port. Married in 1949, had 3 children, lived quietly. The war was private. The memories belonged to him and the men who had been there. Wilhelm Adler returned to Hamburg in June 1946 after nearly 2 years as a POW. He found his city destroyed, 70% rubble. But in a shelter on the eastern edge of the ruins, he found his family, alive, his wife, his 3 children. Greta ran to him crying, "Vater!" "You came home." Adler held his daughter and wept. He had surrendered a fortress to seawater, but that surrender had brought him here, to this moment, to his family alive. He became a teacher, never spoke about the war, but in 1962, at age 62, he wrote a memoir called Fortress of Water. The final chapter acknowledged Thorne's tactic as militarily brilliant and morally sound. Adler wrote that Thorn had defeated him without massacre. That distinction mattered. In 1978, Adler traveled to Newfoundland. 78 years old, wanting to meet the man who had flooded him out 34 years earlier. He found Thorn working on a fishing boat in the harbor, 63 years old, still strong, still connected to the ocean. They looked at each other for a long moment, then Thorn invited Adler aboard his boat. They spent the afternoon on the water not saying much, watching the tides come in and go out, feeling the wind, smelling the salt air. When they returned to shore, Adler finally spoke. In 1944, I thought my family died in Hamburg bombing. The telegram said 70% destroyed. When you flooded my fortress, I had no choice. The radio was dead. I couldn't launch the V-2 rockets even if I wanted to. I surrendered. I went home and found them alive in a shelter. My daughter is a doctor now. Grandchildren 5 and 7. Thorn smiled. I'm glad they survived. If you had attacked conventionally, I would have ordered my men to fight to death. Before surrendering, I would have launched those rockets at Antwerp. 50,000 civilians dead. I would have died never knowing my family lived, never met my grandchildren. You gave me a choice. Surrender or drown. I chose life. Thank you for that choice. The ocean gave you that choice. I just made a hole in the wall. No, you understood something most soldiers never learn, that the smartest victory is one where everyone lives. They sat in silence for a moment. Two old men who had once been enemies, now just two people who understood the sea. I wrote about you, Adler said, in my book. I wanted people to know that war doesn't have to end in blood. Sometimes it can end in water. And sometimes, Thorn said quietly, that water saves more lives than any bullet ever could. They parted as old men who had once been enemies and were now just two people who understood that nature was more powerful than hate. Adler died 3 years later, in 1981, at age 81. Thorn died in 1989 at age 74 from a heart attack while working on his boat. The provincial government named a bridge after him in 1991, the Thorn Bridge. Most people who drove across it never knew why it had that name, never knew about the fortress or the seawall or the 180 Germans who surrendered to seawater or the 50,000 civilians who never knew they were saved. But the lesson remained, written in engineering textbooks, taught in military academies, whispered among soldiers who understood that the smartest weapon isn't always a gun. Sometimes it's just understanding that you don't fight nature. You work with it. You let the current carry you where you need to go. And sometimes that current saves lives on both